No more waivers. Why?
Because we need to really deny Iran the revenue it needs to destabilize the Middle East through all of its proxy wars. And Secretary Pompeo announced about a year ago that we are going to be going to zero imports of Iranian crude oil. And we were able to take off about 1.5 million barrels over the first, I would say, but maybe the last 10, 11 months. Now we are going to take off the remaining 1 million barrels of Iranian crude.
So I was struck by this, Secretary Pompeo earlier today, providing some, I would say, ambiguity in terms of whether or not there's going to be a push on the deadline. Is there any extension past May 2nd, or is that the absolute deadline, or is there any grace period at all?
There will be no renewals of any of the exceptions that have allowed people to import Iranian crude oil. And so those have gone away. There's only about 4 or 5 countries still importing Iranian crude oil. And the current waivers expire on May 2nd, and they will not be renewed.
So will those countries, if they continue to make those types of transactions, are they going to be sanctioned if on May 3rd they continue on?
We don't anticipate that countries are going to choose to risk being sanctioned. To date, no country has. There are over 20 countries that used to import Iranian crude that are now at zero, and they've been there for many months, and there's no hint at all that they want to run afoul of American sanctions. And we don't anticipate that with either. We're essentially giving countries a choice. You can either do business with the United States or you can import Iranian crude oil. And given that choice, it's not a hard decision.
So China is the largest buyer of Iranian crude oil, and they've reiterated their opposition to unilateral sanctions as a result of this. Clearly, that was anticipated. But do you have any concerns about China's message in all of this, or whether or not that would directly impact the oil markets?
I think China's big equity is ensuring a very steady and stable supply of oil. We have worked very closely with Saudi Arabia, and today they released a statement ensuring that they will offset any Iranian barrels that are lost. And so Iranian crude is not an exotic crude, and there's a number of countries that can supply China with its energy needs. There will not be any supply interruption as a consequence of our decision today.
Brian, last time you were here when we asked about this, you said we got to wait until to see what the decision's going to be, but you also said that you wanted to take great care because you didn't want to create any type of volatility in the geopolitical oil market as a whole. Why do you think that the market is in better shape today with this announcement than it was 6 months ago?
Because all of our forecasts show supply exceeding demand. The Saudis are going to be there to offset any losses. The United States has been increasing production. I think if you look at all of the fundamentals, they're very sound, that we have a well-supplied and stable oil market. So if you're driven by the fundamentals, there's no reason to think that this is going to impact the oil markets, because Saudi and UAE and the United States are all working to offset the loss.
What about India?
Well, India has been granted a waiver in the past. They're the second largest importer of Iranian crude oil. But it's just, we're not going to be giving out any more waivers.
And then, do you have any concern that the removal of Iranian crude from the market is going to fuel any other of a price spike? Because you know President Trump doesn't want to see that. We're going to hear about it on Twitter if there's a massive spike in the oil market.
No, and today I think you've seen a slight uptick, but there's a number of drivers behind that even predate the announcement this morning. And so as you look on the dashboard of geopolitical risk, there are a couple of hot spots, but they're not even, I wouldn't even qualify them as hot. So we manage these things, I think, very well. We have calibrated our national security interests and our economic interests. We've done a good job of balancing that so far. We've taken off 1.5 million barrels of Iranian crude, and that has not hurt the oil markets.
All right, so broader step back. Now there's a lot of folks thought that this couldn't be done. Now a year in the making, it's been done. What's the next step? I mean, if ultimately the goal is to get Iran to behave like a country that doesn't want to engage in nuclear activity, what's the next step here now that there's been no more waivers granted?
It puts us in a much better position of economic leverage, because most of the regime's revenue comes from oil exports. So if you want to change Iran's calculus for funding all of these proxy wars around the Middle East, you have to get serious about the oil. We've already seen an impact. Iran is having a harder time meeting their funding commitments for Hezbollah, for Hamas, for their Shia proxies in Syria. And so we want to make it hard for Iran to execute its foreign policy. We're going to continue putting pressure on this regime. We're in the early stages of this, and Iran has a choice. They can either start behaving like a normal nation, or they can watch their economy crumble.